Hey, everybody, welcome to the NYC Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Levine. This is episode number 68. We're getting closer to 100. We're inching up there. And today we have a great guest, Alex Zafran, the Director of Business Development from Logical Buildings. Hey, Alex.
Mark, how are you?
I'm good. Good to see you again. Coming into the Zoom studio. I appreciate it. Before I get into you, why don't I just let everybody know at home, if you want to email the show, you can do that at nycrealestatepodcast@gmail.com. I'm also one of the owners of a few management companies, and we manage co-op, condo, and rental buildings in the New York City area. Been doing it for almost 30 years, so it's great to have everybody that's listening. If you like this, please subscribe and share. But let's get to you, Alex. We've been dealing with a lot of these energy initiatives, the local 97s of the world. Wanted to kind of pick your brain today on not only, I guess, local 97 and what we're up against this year and the short, window. We've got a quarter. We've got 3 months to go before things really kind of hit the fan, maybe. But I wanted to then broach the topic with you, and I think you've got some really great info on how this is more of a larger discussion across all of our properties and kind of going through that. Before we start talking about that, do you want to let everybody at home know kind of where you are, what you do, how you got into it, anything that you want to share? We'd love to hear it.
I appreciate that. Well, Mark, thank you for having me on New York City's number one real estate podcast, undisputed, obviously.
Always.
Um, so I just very quick by background, would never have expected to end up in the energy world of real estate. I started off in the commodity space in finance, and honestly, I found that the personalities of real estate and the personal nature of this business were a lot more fun. No offense to anyone listening who might be in the financial world, but there's a saying in real estate in New York that every building is a snowflake, because in our world, everyone's trying to accomplish the same thing. They want to cut their energy costs. They don't want to get fined. They want to run more efficiently, but the way that the building is set up, the personalities, the way you have to go about to accomplish those things is different every single time. And I'm sure you see that to an extent, Mark, as well
Yep.
when you're managing clients. And that's what makes this business great. It's a very personal business. So, at the end of the day, even though I spend all of my time talking to property managers, owners, executives about their buildings and about ways to cut energy, for me, it's that personal side. Um, Logical Buildings really tries to solve one fundamental problem, which is that buildings don't always have the opportunity to measure what's going on. Meaning, if you can't measure what's happening, then you can't fix it. And specifically in the energy space, in the environment of Local N97, everyone, again, wants to cut their carbon emissions. They want to make this problem go away, but they don't necessarily know how to use information to do that. And it's not sufficient just to give people data and say, well, here you go, good luck, figure it out on your own.
Yeah.
That's not how it works either. So really, Logical Buildings is all about helping buildings use this information to make smarter energy choices and get rewarded for it. So number one, we have a data partnership with Con Edison and with utilities all over the country, where thanks to smart meters, which transmit energy information wirelessly, we were able to give buildings the chance to look under the hood, so to speak, at their energy decisions and what's going on. We train building operators to make sure that they're invested in helping to reduce emissions and to run their buildings more efficiently. And more importantly, we also help buildings earn revenue through utility programs that pay buildings to use less energy, and owners and shareholders actually to use less energy at certain times. So again, it's all going back to take data and help people make better decisions without having to work much harder. That's us.
And that's also from a portfolio perspective. If you have 20 buildings or you have 200 buildings, it doesn't matter. Each building is different. The components are different. The square footage is different. Their energy use components are just totally separate. So it's not a one-stop shop for everybody, right? It all has to be really dedicated towards individualized reporting and then action.
Yeah.
Um, so we're coming up, we're in the beginning to middle of February right now. We're coming up on May 1st. What should we expect that is due on May 1st in the city?
Mm.
And where is the where does that stop? At what square footage? I know the answer, but I would love for you to share it for everybody at home. Like,
Oh.
who are the buildings that are kind of responsible for filing these things, and what do they look like before we get into this broad discussion?
Mm. So if you are lucky enough to have a building over or at 25,000 square feet, then May 1st is I'll call it a triple witching hour. There are three things due for you on this date. Number one, something called energy benchmarking, known as Local Law 84, probably something that you've been doing for several years.
Yep.
Shouldn't be too much of a change. Second thing, a one-time report called Local Law 88, something actually you spoke about in your last podcast with Amanda Jerome.
Yeah.
The city's requirement for buildings to ensure that their lighting is up to code, and also that if they're commercial tenants, to make sure that those tenants, if they are 5,000 square feet or above, are sub-metered or have direct meters to Con Edison. And last but not least, everyone's favorite quote unquote Local Law 97, which has been in the works for a very, very long time. And finally, after many years of planning and much consternation and frustration, it is coming into place. Not every building has to submit on May 1st, but a majority of those over 25,000 square feet for the first time are going to have to submit a report showing the amount of carbon that they used in calendar year 2024.
Now you said almost everybody has to do it. What are the carve outs to not have to do it if you're a building for May 1st?
So this gets into the idea of, we'll call them pathways. And I think it's important because we want to make sure that if a building doesn't necessarily have to report right now on May 1st, then they should be cognizant of that. Not that they should put all of their efforts aside, but use the extra time to make more decisions that can help to improve their position in the future. So what's called the standard quote unquote pathway for most buildings is annual Local Law 97 filings beginning this May 1st. Every year they go through that process of submitting that data to the Department of Buildings. If a building has between 1 to 35%, but no more than 35% rent regulated units, they're going to have to go through this annual process. But instead of starting this May 1st, it begins May 1st of 2027. So they have a couple more years to look under the hood and try to make energy decisions that will help to minimize fines in the future. If a building has at least one income restricted unit, then there is an exception that those buildings don't have to file until 2035. So all of these get into the idea that when a building is reviewing its information before submission to Local Law 97 or before the partner that you're working with, make sure that you've got your apartment count right. Make sure, more importantly, that the city has you designated for the right branch.
Right.
Because the city hasn't taken account for the fact that you do have some rent regulated units, you don't necessarily have to file on May 1st. Make sure that all that data is right. And then the final branch or the final pathway that really applies to potential co-ops, condos, and HDFCs is something called Article 321. We'll put that aside for a second, but this is really primarily for buildings that have over 35% rent regulated units and that are designated as affordable buildings by the city. They have a separate pathway that's a little bit more involved, that has one-time compliance, but there are more obligations incumbent upon them than others. So those are the four different pathways right now.
So we have a lot of information with our company in dealing with a lot of the energy, whether it's gas, oil, water, heat. Now, can you just go into detail for 2 seconds on it's not only just a common area, but we're taking into effect or into account all of the private spaces too. So even if, let's say, call it shareholders, unit owners, or renters have their own submetering through gas and electric, we're still counting all of that towards our carbon capture, right? So it's not just the common areas that we're really focused on. We're trying to drive down energy usage everywhere. And you did actually discuss that before, that you have products in place that you could hook into like Con Ed and you could wirelessly transmit. And that has been successful in a lot of, and in some buildings that we've used your software in, where we're able to get ahead of the high demand events, whether it's the summer or, with heating or cooling, right? I guess in the summer it'd be cooling, pre-cooling, so that when the higher demand events come, we turn off our cooling, and it's a lot cheaper for the building that way. What other aspects of just a typical building, the way that we go through operating a building, could we look to if we weren't using a software that could tell us these things, where we could really restrict our energy usage over time?
Well, I think so. You bring up two important points, Mark. The first about the concept of whole building energy data, which for local law 97 is required, like you said, for everyone. No stone is left unturned. Shareholders, owners, commercial space, residential spaces. And there are two huge distinctions that are really important that every building should be thinking about right now, even before they touch their local law 97 report. And it actually starts in energy benchmarking. So for those who are listening who might not be familiar, energy benchmarking requires buildings to submit energy data and water data to the city, as well as information about their buildings. It doesn't penalize them for using it doesn't penalize them for using too much energy, so to speak, but it creates accountability. It requires buildings to share this information. But the problem with the process is there isn't always data verification. It's up to buildings or companies they hire to submit this information to the city, but it's not always checked. And the reason this matters for local law 97 is because if for whatever reason some information is left out of local law 84 of the benchmarking, because that data is going to flow directly into local law 97, there is going to be automatically a flaw in the local law 97 report. So when buildings
So,
are going through,
like for an example, just to cut you off for a second, if I have a building that's dual fuel and they are running on oil when the temperature drops where we need it to, below 18 degrees, but on the report, potentially it wasn't reported as oil used at all or delivered at all that year, it's not going to calculate the energy use correctly because it's not taking into account the oil use that we had that year. So that skews the numbers. And then if that gets transmitted automatically over to 97, then the 97 numbers are wrong.
exactly right, exactly right. And even the inverse. Let's suppose a building has made the decision to move off of oil and they've executed a conversion to firm gas, which means that they're using natural gas wholly to heat the building. Now, let's say for whatever reason, if someone's going through the benchmarking process, somehow that oil value from the prior year gets reproduced again. Again, not necessarily someone's fault, but this is what happens in the system for benchmarking. That means that it's going to look like the building is actually using more carbon than it should, and it should be penalized. I've seen, unfortunately, this happened a lot, especially in the COVID era, when Con Ed couldn't send out meter readers to go look at accounts. This was before smart meters, which deliver information digitally. When Con Ed couldn't send out meter readers to check to see how much energy was being used, they would estimate bills. And eventually, after Con Ed was able to resume normal operations, they would naturally cancel those estimated bills and they would send new bills to buildings for the accurate information. But Portfolio Manager, which is the system for benchmarking, didn't know how to pick up the fact that Con Ed was canceling the prior readings. So what it looked like on Portfolio Manager was that during the months of COVID, a building was using double the amount of gas or double the amount of electricity that it really was. Fortunately, that's been reconciled, but you can only imagine the impact of how that would be today if it looked like Con Edison or National Grid was overbilling for energy, and that led to overstated carbon penalties. So this concept of whole building energy usage and making sure the data is so correct, this is an exercise in good data management. At the end of the day, if we take away the concept of energy and we take away the aspect of carbon fines, local law 97 is really about having good data. If a building has accurate energy information, and if it has accurate information about the size of the building, the square footage, it means it's going to be doing the right thing in terms of completing its compliance for the city.
So you bring up something about basically the gross floor area of each building. And when I made my initial spreadsheet years back on, it really flowed first from like the local 84, local 87 database to make sure that I had my above 25,000, above 50,000,
Right.
multiple blocks and lots at 100,000, right? And there were different like scenarios that under 25, I don't have to worry about it. And now I got all that information from the Department of Finance. And that was how I started that spreadsheet. We have gone through the process while we're looking at the local 97 reports to say, okay, does it make sense for us to have an architect come into the building and do a pure review of the building size? Because while we've said that before, the gas, the heating, the reporting could sway in one direction or another, your report and your findings. The same could be true about how this all relates to your size.
Yeah.
So, what are I guess, like the percentages of the buildings that you're seeing that are going the extra step right now before 97 is due to map out their true size to see how this plays into their ultimate report at the end of the day?
Really, it's such a critical point. I would say that any building that is looking at fines in the future, meaning maybe a building that is reporting, like we said, starting this year, or starting in 2027 if it's delayed, doesn't necessarily have fines immediately, but they might have in 2030. Buildings that have fines in the horizon are all turning towards these things called gross floor area studies. So to go back to something you also said, which is important, the Department of Finance is actually the arbiter and the keeper of square footage information in the city. So if anyone were to Google their buildings right now, you'd see a Department of Finance figure. And it's used for tax purposes. But interestingly, Local Law 97 is making use of a different metric, and that's called gross floor area. And GFA, for short, usually encapsulates spaces that the Department of Finance doesn't, such as hallways, elevator shafts, basements, atriums. And what's happening is, going back to the data management, sometimes buildings are underreporting their square footage. And if they're underreporting their square footage, it actually is shooting them in the foot. Because if you have a larger building, but you're using the same amount of energy, it means by definition, you're more efficient. We had a Midtown mixed use building that came to us because they had a feeling that something was amiss and their square footage was off. And they had, it's a condo tower, but they've got a preschool, they've got a cafe, they've got also different amenity spaces and some office space in there, all of which are using energy for different purposes and have different carbon allowances. So on top of the fact that they weren't necessarily appropriating carbon in the right way, it turned out that the square footage was being underestimated by something like 50,000 square feet.
Wow.
Now, this is a massive building. So for them, the impacts were significant. But even if a building has square footage that might be off by 1,000, 5,000, 7,000 square feet, by completing this study, which has an engineer come in and actually map out the space, if it turns out that your square footage is bigger than what the Department of Finance says, you are going to see a decrease in your carbon fines.
Is this something that we could do also let's say May 1st comes and we filed? August, we want to do the gross floor area study. Can we retroactively change it, or is what we submit on the Local 97 report gospel?
As
And
of
that may
now,
not be known yet. I don't know if that's even known.
the way that the Department of Buildings has been communicating it so far is that it is gospel. What could happen alternatively is, let's say a building submits their information, and this, I'm sure, by the way, there are 30,000 plus buildings in the city. I'm sure some of them will, treat what I'm saying as hogwash, and they'll say, oh, okay, I'll submit the Department of Finance number, meaning they'll just say, well, my building is 50,000 square feet. I'm going to say it's 50,000 square feet. What could happen afterwards, and we don't know, is the Department of Buildings might come back and say, hey, 123 Main Street, prove to me that you're 50,000 square feet, or else we will penalize you. So in that case, it becomes a challenge of, will the building be able to get that information in time? And if they can't, do they have any records on file? But you do ask a very good question about the enforcement of that gross floor area.
So what does this mean? I know we kind of teased in the beginning about a larger discussion with regards to energy over the next few years. I think everybody is not, I won't say everybody, the vast overwhelming majority of people can't see the forest through the trees. And I think that is May 1st. We don't know. Okay, we're all getting ready for May 1st. Let's jump forward. Where do we go from here? Like this has overtaken years of our just common, brain power, and now we're gonna hit this benchmark. We're gonna file it. We know that there's certain reductions that have to be done in certain buildings, and you get penalized for being over the threshold. But in most buildings, what are we looking at in the global industry as it sits?
So, I'm smiling because I think about real estate it's an emotional business. And for a lot of these shareholders and owners, these the things that are being discussed are one of the most significant assets in their lives. So it makes sense that in human nature, territorially, if energy laws or other local law compliance seems to quote unquote encroach on what we're doing, it makes sense that people have an emotional, visceral reaction. I think that after May 1st, it's going to begin to settle a little bit, just like it settles for all local laws in New York City. It becomes part of the status quo. It becomes a repeatable, familiar process. So after that, the question becomes, if I'm a building and I'm filing every May 1st for the next 25 years, that's the arc of Local Law 97. If I have to go through this exercise every year, and I know that every 5 years, the efficiency limits are going to get more stringent, what am I going to do so that my children or grandchildren who one day might take over my apartment aren't left with these assessments to make up for these fines? When you have that understanding that this becomes a decision-making process over time, and it's not just about what you're doing May 1st, it's what you're doing between every May 1st, then I think the reason starts to set in over emotion. And where we like to begin really is that data. When we started our business, and we come from a real estate background, the concept really was trying to empower people to make decisions with energy information without having them work harder. And because of the way that we integrate with Con Ed smart meters, by the way, instead of taking one energy usage at the beginning of the month and the end of the month and just showing people how much they used, Con Edison smart meters are equipped to show energy usage every hour of the day. But the problem is Con Edison doesn't necessarily give users or give their customers the infrastructure to see it. So when you unlock this energy data for someone and you show them what it looks like, when you show them, if you're a co-op and condo, looks like your boiler's running in the middle of the night on a Saturday, or we know that people went away for a holiday during this weekend and you might expect to see lower common usage. Why is it that electricity costs are still constant during that period? You start to find ways that are available and achievable to lower energy usage and cut costs, not necessarily just for the purpose of one-time carbon compliance, but throughout the year. I'll give you a good example. So Con Edison measures energy usage not only based on how much you use, but when you use it. Imagine you walk home, you step into your apartment or your home, you turn on the lights, you turn on the AC, you open the fridge, you maybe use the dishwasher. You're using all these appliances all at once. Think about it at a higher level from the perspective of a building, common areas, you've got all of this load or all of this energy usage being activated right at once. So when you give buildings insight into, let's say, when that peak happens, is it happening at 4 o'clock, at 6 o'clock? Is it happening at a time when it's not supposed to be happening? You're giving people a way to start making adjustments and to experiment and to find ways for them to use less. So I think the best buildings in New York City, the most efficient buildings in New York City are going to be the ones that are using equipment like even Parity, which does HVAC control, like Runwise, like Entech, like other companies with boiler controls. So on top of that, Logical Buildings tries to be the equivalent for electricity and for carbon so that buildings can see how they're performing. And most importantly, the buildings that have investment all the way from the executive level down to the engineers and the supers who are working the building day by day, that's where you've got the most success. And if you can show them that there's a way for them to, even in buildings with smart thermostats, to control energy usage without having to go around, to set up schedules on the HVAC so that they know to turn down, they know to reduce operations at certain times to avoid those peaks. buildings with automation and buildings with that rinse and repeat process, those are the ones that are really going to fare the best in the future.
So I get I'm having trouble speaking today. I guess you've been super busy the last year while you ramp up towards the
Say
end
that.
date of May. What are you focusing on after May 1st? Once all your check boxes are submitted, um, for logical buildings, where do you see yourself kind of focusing on the next 6 months after that?
So interestingly, after May 1st comes a very important time in New York City, which is the season of what's called demand response. And demand response is this utility program. It's actually a national concept where utilities will pay buildings and the residents in those buildings to use less energy. So every year we go through a process where we speak to buildings and we let them know that this is available to them. Not every building may want to participate. And mind you, Logical Buildings doesn't control any systems. We're not making any mandates. We sit down with buildings and we put together basically custom lists of action items to help them use less energy. And the way this works at the macro level is Con Edison, when it's really hot outside, think of those unbearably brutal New York City summer days. It's 95 degrees, you're on the subway, you're sweating as soon as you walk out of your home or your business. On those days, Con Edison needs to relieve stress on the grid. And it's cheaper for them to pay people to use less energy than it is for them to buy extra energy. So they have this program where they will ask common areas of buildings and residents to use less during certain times. So during the summer, what we're really focused on at Logical Buildings is how are we going to maximize that revenue for buildings? What are some of the measures that they're going to implement that can earn them money during that period? And again, doing so without inconveniencing or causing safety issues or discomfort to the residents. It's not like people turn off all the lights and leave their residence without AC.
Yeah.
Taking small decisions that will have these targeted impacts. So for the next right after May 1st, it's an immediate pivot into demand response. And on top of that, if buildings do have compliance fines, or if they are paying someone for local N97 compliance, they might as well use the revenue from demand response to offset that. And if they're taking actions anyways for local N97, and they're already in the mindset of being more efficient, they deserve to get paid for it. There's no reason they shouldn't.
What's the I guess the average price, if there is an average price for buildings to kind of get into this program, that demand response program, where you're overseeing all of the energy there, you're working with them, you're communicating with the board, you're communicating with the manager, maybe the super. Um, what does that look like in terms of pricing from your standpoint? And if you don't have a general, that's okay too. I just wanted to know, like, for people listening, if there's, a shot at saving money by training residents to act as a certain way within their energy usage and also for the building. Maybe it's something like shutting down the laundry during those high demand areas. If you got 12 machines running and everybody understands that, okay, it's going to cost us a lot more to run these machines than the possible amenity that you have during those 2 hours, but we could communicate that and the reasons why. I think it would make sense from a certain standpoint to say, okay, it's going to cost us X, we're going to save Y. But I don't know if that's like a one-stop shop for you guys, or if it's based on a size, if there's a variable cost for that. Anything you could share about that?
So I'll go first. I'll talk, I guess, structure, and I'll say that the way that we operate is based on fundamentally a revenue share, and we want to make sure that the building is getting paid the majority of the revenue that they earn, while we take the minority. So that is the big overarching revenue structure of how this works. There is a cost for us to, let's say, onboard the building, to sit down with them, to give them access to our energy platform called SmartKit, which will allow them to see the energy usage at the building, and an annual fee for them to utilize that platform over time, and to use it regularly, not only in the context of local N97, but also to reduce energy at all times. I think also that the interesting part about this business, and the way I personally like to operate is that sometimes it doesn't make sense for buildings. And it's easy to do a revenue analysis where we take a look at the electricity load at a building. For instance, if it's a building that's a smaller walk up and doesn't have much common area space, it might not necessarily make sense for them to participate. However, if their residents are direct metered, i.e., they pay their own Con Ed bills, they should participate. We have a platform called Grid Rewards. It's a no-cost app that anyone in New York City can download who pays Con Ed bills. It shows them their energy usage, and they can participate in this program. In other cases, if there is a building with high electricity usage, common areas, amenities, maybe it's got central air, those are indications that a building can actually reduce energy in a meaningful way. But really, the conversation begins from a point of honesty where sometimes buildings might want to work with us just to see their energy usage or to monitor, let's say, the ROI of a new system they implement. For instance, they might put in a new HVAC, maybe they upgrade a new boiler. They want to see the moment at which that savings takes place. Meaning, if you install
Right.
this new equipment, when do you actually start seeing the ROI? So demand response, I tell everyone it doesn't always make sense for buildings, but there's no reason that every building shouldn't go through that analysis of seeing what is possible and then having a conversation about what kind of energy measures are available in our building in order to make that revenue happen.
Are you guys doing anything with solar or alternative energy sources?
We personally don't operate solar, if that's what you're asking. However, any building that's using solar or cogen or different sources, they are great for this kind of program. What we do is something called, in fancy terms, a virtual power plant, which means imagine a building with common areas and residents all using thermostats at different temperatures. It doesn't make sense for temperatures to stay cool if the units aren't occupied. And it doesn't make sense for the common areas also to, let's say, be cool during the summer when there's lower usage. So the concept of a virtual power plant means taking all of these thermostats, centralizing their control so that the engineering or the operations team can make these changes in one fell swoop, obviously with the understanding that that individual temperatures can be overridden. But when you centralize this process, you're creating a significant amount of energy savings. Also, we did a project with a Midtown hotel. They used this for demand response, meaning when their residents, or excuse me, when the guests of the hotel were not in their rooms, they were able to make a small change, make a few degree change in the temperature in order to earn revenue. So I think that any building that is already making some decision about energy, whether it's a new technology, whether it's new boiler upgrades. And I think to the credit of many New York City buildings, most condos and co-ops are already exploring this. But if they're already investing in that technology, it helps to have the resource to be able to see the results of what they're doing and actually put numbers to paper.
Well, that's super helpful. I know we're edging on our time, but I'm going to put all of your contact information in the description of the video. If you wanted to get in touch with Alex over email, Zafran, Azafran at logicalbuildings.com, and I'll leave your email, I'll leave your LinkedIn, I'll leave your phone number so everybody, if they want, they can call. I know I've been working with Alex on a bunch of projects for the last year or two, and you guys are great to work with. You're an easy to work with company. Obviously, you're here, you're providing great information, and I thank you not only for coming on here, but also with my team. I have 17 property managers that you've hopped onto meetings as like a training session for everybody and to go over everything portfolio wide. So I appreciate that. Before we go, is there anything else that you kind of wanted to bring up to the audience about something that maybe come due or something that you just might find interesting? And if we've exhausted all the topics today, that's also fine. I'll leave it in your court.
I thank you, Mark. And I'm a huge fan of EBMG, the way you run your business,
Thank you.
the way you are not afraid to get on social media and use tools like podcasts to share the great things that are happening in EBMG and even just give others like me a platform. So thank you for that.
No problem.
The message that I try really to dispel is that I come from a place of humility, knowing that energy is not the first thing on people's minds. People aren't thinking about it, especially actually, as you said, also in that podcast with Amanda last week. Sometimes real estate is reactive in that if something else happens, you drop everything and you got to put out that fire. And I get it. I am not a property manager nor an owner, but I can appreciate that this is the nature of business. And my goal, the way I work, the person I am, is to be that person that when it does matter, when for whatever reason energy does become the thing that needs to be reacted to, we hope to be the ones that address it and do it honestly, do it without fancy talk, do it without bogging people down in regulation or using fear to drive business. It's really just about talking to people and seeing if you can help their problems. And that's how I live my life.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I agree with that, the way of living. I think you should get your own podcast going. I think that there could be some value in that too for you guys.
Thank you.
We'll see how this one does. Well,
Yeah.
I really thank you for your time. I think, we're probably going to have more of this as we go. I'm sure that things are going to shift after May and there will be more to talk about and then more procedures that we could put into place as, this is for us, this is only a few years old, and we're talking about, I've been around for 30 years. The industry's been around for much longer than that. Technology is getting better. Requirements are getting tighter. So I think the combination of both is going to lead us to kind of butt heads, with the city a little bit more while we try to get everything that they need done, but also understand that we're operating not with like endless pockets here. The boards, the building owners, whether it's a rental or a co-op condo, there's only so far that you can go before you start to bleed a little bit of money. So finding that balance and having enough of a runway is going to be important in all these conversations. And these types of conversations are very helpful to have because then we can start to put all this down onto paper and understand what we can and what we can't do, how much it will and how much it won't cost. And the only way that you could do that is by planning. So I want to thank you for your time. Stick around after we end this recording. We'll say goodbye. But for everybody at home on the podcast, I just want to remind you, if you want to email the show, if you've made it this far, NYC Real Estate Podcast at gmail.com. You can also email me on my corporate email at mblevine@ebmg.com. And we look forward to a lot more of this in 2025. I think we're starting off pretty strong. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Mark.